Welcome to another episode of This Is Why I Don't Vote, a podcast. Season 3, Episode 25. Your safe space to discuss sports, politics, social issues, and even religion, where we will take it all very seriously, but not too seriously. The rise of the college Superconference continues, and it does so by the cannibalization, the destruction of other Power 5 conferences. The Pac-12 is going the way of the dodo. And I would be remiss if I did not do a segment on the New York Metropolitans and the fire sale that was their strategy at the trade deadline, trading away many players, the marquee trades being, of course, Justin Verlander and Max Scherzer. Thank you all for your continued support, your continued patronage. It really does mean a lot to me. On with the show.
Act 1, Bye Pac-12.
Bye Pac-12. Hello Superconference. The Big 12 of all conferences. A conference I thought would actually be destroyed by the epoch, the era of the Superconference. Big 12 went out and made good this week. The Big 12 made a few waves, not many, but a few, by accepting Colorado back into the flock. After the 2023 season, I believe the beginning of the 2024 season, and then, lo and behold, Arizona, Arizona State, and Utah are also going to leave the Pac-12 to join the Big 12. That punch to the jaw follows up the kick to the groin that was Oregon and Washington leaving the Pac-12 to join the Big 10, which, by the way, makes absolutely no sense unless, of course, I was completely right. And it's one of the few times I'll probably ever be able to say that on this podcast, that in fact, this is going to be the era of the Superconference. The Big Ten is basically the NFL in college sports. There is no geographic boundary to the Big Ten. The Big Ten's geographic boundary is the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico. You say, what Gulf of Mexico team is part of the Big Ten? None yet. I emphasize the word yet. The fates of these conferences are so fleeting. It wasn't but a few years ago that everyone suspected, there were many a prophecy, that the Big 12 was not going to survive as a conference, that the instability that was created by so many of the Big 12 teams leaving the conference, well, not so many of the teams, the two powerhouses, Oklahoma and Texas, these teams leaving the Big 12 would mean the inevitable destruction of the Big 12. And yet, in this new landscape, this new pillaging landscape, this landscape where these conferences are cannibalizing one another, it's the Big 12 that came out the winner, and the Pac-12 looks like it's going to completely fall apart. I'm going to try to stay out of my ego when I say this. I know that a lot of people on the East Coast have East Coast bias towards their teams, these conferences. Growing up on the East Coast, moving to the West Coast, many of the prejudices that people have against the Pac-12, they're true. The Pac-12 often has a smugness about it, the way that it was run, the way that it was governed, as if it was the equal to the SEC and the Big Ten, and that it warranted the types of television packages that those two conferences warranted, when in fact, many of the games were televised at the wrong time, and by way of the wrong time, I mean they were not being televised to optimize viewership on the East Coast. Many people in the Pac-10, the Pac-12 were still under the illusion that having this well-rounded, this robust sports program where, take for instance Stanford, I believe Stanford is one of the schools that routinely wins the Sports Cup every year in college, and I can't remember what it's called. I know it has a name, a term of art, and I'm not going to look it up. Stanford wins the most national championships. Stanford's going to win a national championship in women's volleyball, in men's water polo. They're going to be competitive in a number of college sports. The problem being, putting money into all of those sports, while there's nothing wrong with it, it doesn't generate the athletic department, the school, any money. It's basically the big three, right? It's college football, that's number one, college basketball, that's number two, and then a long distance third, men's baseball. The Pac 12 came to the party too late to garner the type of television rights that would promote it into the 21st century. And I've read a couple of things about the deals that the Pac 12 was trying to put together, one of them with Apple TV, where I believe that the guarantee was somewhere between $20 and $30 million per school per year. And although that sounds like a lot of money, having $350 million in television rights, I believe the Big Ten signed a television rights deal with Fox and NBC and maybe CBS Sports that aggregately over the course of a decade was $7 billion. Let me repeat that. $7 billion with a B. $7 billion. That's pro sports. That's a pro sports television deal. Just doing some quick math in my head, it looks as if the Big Ten was getting twice the money that the Pac-12 could garner, and it was on a different platform. It wasn't on your NBC, your CBS, your Fox, your ABC. It was on Apple TV. So Apple TV was very likely overpaying what they thought the television rights would be in order to get the Pac-12. And it was still half of the amount of money that the Big Ten garnered from the major sports networks. College football is now like so many American institutions. I mean, we really, in this country, like to believe, like to feel like we honor tradition. Like we have so many traditions in this country. And you look at most of the traditions that we have in this country, there are very few that you can look at and say, this is a tradition from the inception of the Republic. Besides celebrating July 4th, there aren't many on the list that you can say, this has been a tradition throughout our brief 300-year history. And saying 300 years is a stretch that's inaccurate. It hasn't even been 300 years. We can't even cobble together many traditions that can last beyond 50 years. Will I miss the Rose Bowl for what it was, the Big Ten versus the Pac-10? Yes, I will. Will some of you listening to this miss it as well? Yes, you will. You ask anyone who's 25 years old about it, they have no idea what you're talking about. So what does the future hold? Frankly, I have absolutely no idea. I think at least in the near future, and this is not really a bold prediction, the teams that are left in the Pac-12, they're going to be absorbed by some other conference. I think the Pac-12 is dead. I don't know whether or not the Pac-12 can survive by trying to invite into its ranks some of the schools in the West Coast Conference or any of the other regional schools on the western coast of the United States of America. I mean, is adding Gonzaga and St. Mary's going to boost the profile of the conference when neither one of those schools plays football? Well, I don't think they play football. Even if they do play football, they don't play football in Division I, and that's what you need in order to garner the type of television money to get the television rights to support a conference in the 21st century. Now, perhaps the Pac-12 will go out and try to court some teams outside of its geographic region. The problem with that has always been you have teams that are in this conference that are not as big as the USCs of the world, the UCLAs of the world. It costs a lot of money to travel. And Arizona State, they're going to very much enjoy playing in the Big 12, even though, yes, they have to go out now to the east. They have to go into the Eastern time zone. Look at a map and look at where Arizona State is. Look at where Arizona is, and then look at where Oregon and Oregon State are. There's no difference between Arizona having to travel to West Virginia and Arizona having to travel to Oregon State. The Big Ten has certainly solidified itself as the power conference in the quote-unquote Power Five, and I have to use that quote-unquote term because one of the Power Five looks like it's on its deathbed. And from the ashes, the phoenix of the group, the Big 12, looks like it's not only going to survive, but it's going to come out much stronger. There is some more movement to be had, and if you are the ACC, you've got to be quaking in your boots. You've actually got to be concerned after seeing this entire destruction of one of the Power 5 conferences, albeit on the other side of the country. You still have to think, we've got some chinks in the armor over here, and we've got this behemoth in the SEC that may still be licking its lips thinking that there are a couple of teams in our conference that they can take, namely Florida State, namely Clemson. And what are Florida State and Clemson thinking? Let us not be naive, dear listener. There is no loyalty in college sports, certainly with the kind of money that's being thrown around. Again, Big Ten, $7 billion television deal. So are Clemson and Florida State looking to make a move? You're damn right they are. And they're looking to make a move into the SEC. It wouldn't surprise me if in the next 6 months a deal is announced where Clemson and Florida State are going to leave the ACC for the SEC. And of course, that is going to create a ripple effect through the entire Eastern Seaboard when it comes to these college football allegiances. And yes, it's all driven by football. And we are all one step closer to what is, in college sports, college football in particular, the AFC and the NFC. Now, I don't know, again, which one you like better, or if it even matters, whether or not calling the Big Ten the AFC and the SEC the NFC, or vice versa, really matters. We are well on our way to having college sports mirror pro sports, namely college football mirroring pro football. 2 conferences, 2 leagues, and maybe one day 1 super league. The leagues will actually be independent in name, but because of the money, the television rights, they will combine their efforts and they will blow off the NCAA and create their own super league. I'd like to say that this is some kind of prescient, this is some kind of sixth sense type of prediction. Frankly, I'm just following the path of the money, and I don't know that I'm the only one that's doing it. In our lifetime, dear listener, we may very well look back at our college days and not only think how archaic it was that we slept in the kind of dorms that we slept in, and we went to the kind of recreation that we went to. We look at the entire sports landscape and how amateurish it was, and that is a relic of the past. We look at the NCAA as an organizing body, as an authoritative body that was actually meting out penalties to member schools, in the same vein as we would remember one of the king's magistrates meting out justice based on one of the king's edicts. We know it happened in this country. We have no personal recollection of it. Now, that may not be us, dear listener. That may not be you and I. That may be your children. And that will certainly be your children's children.
Act 2 Steve Cohen, the New York Metropolitans, and the concept of sunk cost.
The New York Metropolitans had a fire sale this past week at the Major League Baseball trade deadline. Got rid of a lot of marquee players, expensive players. Whether or not they are good players, that's a debate for another time. I do not want to have the debate as to whether or not they are good players, players past their prime. It doesn't matter. In the immortal words of Bill Parcells, you are what your record says you are. The Mets, with the highest payroll not only in Major League Baseball this year, but in Major League Baseball history, did not perform to expectations, did not perform to even mediocre expectations. They are a sub-500 team, and it was time to sell. So many of people that I know have scoffed at one Patrick Knackley over the fact that the New York Metropolitans have not only traded away a number of these marquee, these very expensive players, they are also taking on the payroll in order to have these players shipped off. So they've traded away the player, and the other team has said, we're not going to pay a majority of the salary, you still have to pay it even though you don't have the services of that player. And the New York Metropolitans have said, yes, we will do this. This has brought about some wry smiles, derision, laughing out loud at the New York Metropolitans. Let's discuss, though, why the Mets did what they did and why it is such a sound economic concept, that of the sunk cost. Steve Cohen, the owner of the New York Metropolitans, a hedge fund billionaire, understands fundamentally, whatever you think of him, whatever you think of the way that he has earned his money, he understands economics. He understands fundamental or basic economic concepts. One of the most fundamental, one of the most basic economic concepts is the concept of the sunk cost. What is a sunk cost? Quite simply, it's money that has been spent that you can no longer recover. The best real world, the best layperson concept of the sunk cost is buying a used car. And not buying a used car from a dealership even, but let's say you buy a used car from another individual. You get the car does not turn out to be what you think the car is. You try to chase after that individual has disappeared, you are now stuck with this car. What do you do? If you paid $10,000 for the car, and the car does not work, and when you take it into a dealership, you take it into a mechanic, they tell you what the problems are, they tell you what the value of the car is, what do you do? I practiced law for 20 years. You can use this same analogy with a home. People will spend the money chasing after the other person, chasing after the person that they believe did them wrong, before they will actually spend the money to make the situation right, before they will write off the money as a sunk cost. Back to the car, and then we can go into a home analogy. If you paid $10,000 for the car, and you take it to a mechanic because it no longer works, and the mechanic tells you it's going to cost you $10,000 to fix the car that you have, what do you do? Well, in the principle of the sunk cost, it'd be smarter to just turn that car into the dealership, get whatever you can for it, and then use the $10,000 that you were going to spend to fix it on another car, preferably a newer car that has a warranty through the dealership. Now, a home analogy. You buy a home for $250,000. You believe that that home is in habitable condition. You move in. That home is not in habitable condition. It has roof problems. It has foundation problems. You get estimates to fix all of those problems. Let's say the estimates are 10% of the home value. They're $25,000. What do? Do you spend $25,000 fixing up that home that you've already purchased, or you spend $25,000 chasing after the people who sold you the home? Now let us look at the real world example of the New York Metropolitans. As we discussed at the beginning of the Major League Baseball season, not only did I do a segment on my own on this podcast, I had my buddy Brian come on. We talked about this at the beginning of this season. The Mets went all in on older pitching. They had a strong pitching staff last year, namely their bullpen. They had a very strong bullpen last year, and they thought that they were going to bolster that very strong pitching staff after having lost a Cy Young winner. They were going to add Justin Verlander. Now they have Max Scherzer and Justin Verlander at the top of that pitching staff. On paper, that looks great. These two gentlemen are older, not by way of human years, but in baseball years. They've been around for a while. They've pitched a lot of pitches. They've been in a lot of wins. They've been in a lot of losses. So they've got miles on them. And it was going to be an experiment, if you will, an experiment to see whether or not a pitching staff that was so old was going to be able to hold up over the course of an entire season. The other part of that experiment was the fact that, of course, they paid ungodly sums to these two pitchers to come to New York. They had the highest payroll in all of baseball history, adding in not only those two pitchers, but several other players. Did it work? Of course, we know it did not work. Now, the money was already spent. And this is what a lot of people don't understand about the concept of a sunk cost. If you get into a contract with a player in baseball, those contracts are guaranteed Once you've signed that contract, whatever that number is that you signed that player to, you owe the player that money, barring some unforeseen circumstances. I don't want to get into any kind of contingencies as to whether or not a player does something that could invalidate the contract. Once you sign the contract for the number, you know you owe that player that number. If you sign a pitcher for $40 million for 3 seasons, you know over the course of the next 3 seasons, you're going to pay that pitcher $40 million. That pitcher may pitch well. That pitcher may pitch poorly. That pitcher may get hurt, and you still owe the pitcher the money if they're sitting there on the injured reserve, on the bench, watching most of the baseball games during the course of the baseball season. That pitcher may warrant being traded, and you may want, understand what I just said, you may want to pay some of that pitcher's salary even though they're no longer on your staff, on your team. That is the concept of the sunk cost. The money has been spent, you were stuck in the situation that you were stuck in, and you're not going to be able to get the money back. What is the appropriate decision to make based on the circumstances that you're currently facing? What's the smartest decision to make? And people with money usually follow the principle of the sunk cost. They don't look emotionally at the situation. They look practically at the situation. I've said this about different real estate moguls in the context of Donald Trump. Once a deal goes south, it is not uncommon for anyone in real estate, whether or not they're a bank, whether or not they're a commercial entity, whether or not there's the individual investors, they go upside down in a deal. The deal starts to lose money. They breach. It's a sunk cost. They put a lot of money into a deal. The deal isn't making money. The deal now starts losing money. The deal does not look like it can be salvageable. They either try to get out of that deal or they breach. They don't continue to invest money into something that is no longer a viable prospect to make them money. So when you look at Justin Verlander, when you look at Max Scherzer in particular, 2 pitchers that the New York Metropolitans are going to pay basically over the course of the next 2 seasons over $100 million collectively without the services of their pitching, without them being on the team, you think to yourself, wow, that looks pretty stupid. No, that is the smart decision. The team was 5 or 6 games under 500 at the All-Star break. The team was 5, 6, 7 games under 500 at the trade deadline. This was not a salvageable season. What did the Mets do? They went out and traded 2 of these marquee players, 2 of their more expensive players. Again, whether or not they are worth the money, that's another debate for another time. And they were able to get extremely valuable players in return that could go into their farm system that are very likely to become very good, if not great, major league players in the next 2 to 4 years. Again, the money is already spent. You can't look at whether or not you're able to salvage the value of the money that you invested and then make that be the litmus test. Make that be the barometer as to whether or not you're going to make a move or a deal. It doesn't matter what the context is, whether or not it's that car that you bought, whether or not it's that house that you bought, whether or not it's that pitcher that you decided to pay $40 million a year to. The money in your mind has to already be spent. And then you have to make the wisest economic decision based on the circumstances that you face at the present moment. Now, let's take a bit of a different angle here. This is not a lecture. I am the first to admit that over the course of my life, I did not adhere to the principle of the sunk cost, that I routinely would make decisions emotionally about what I had invested in something in order to determine what the next step was in that negative investment, in the loss that I was taking. There are many others where we have bought something that we did not get the value of, that immediately upon our purchase, we had lost money by way of the value of the item that we invested in. And instead of looking at it as a sunk cost, the money's already spent, we're not going to get it back, we were emotional about what the next steps were, and it very likely cost us more money. The point of playing those baseball games is to win them. And if you are no longer winning them, and you are no longer winning them with the players that you've assembled on your team, and by the way, you just happen to have the highest payroll in baseball history, what is the next best move? Is it to just stick with the players that you've assembled under the largest team salary in baseball history? Or do you start to move some of those players in anticipation of building up another baseball team that may perform better, using those very players as bargaining chips, as leverage to get yourself some young prospects to build for the future? It's not everyone that can go out and spend maybe $50, $100 million and then have that turn into a sunk cost and say, well, I'm going to go out and make the smartest economic decision that I can, the most practical decision that I can, in light of the fact that I just blew $50 or $100 million. Be that as it may, we can apply that principle in our own lives where we make a bad decision, and the only way that we know it's bad is in hindsight, is in retrospect. We've made the decision, now we're realizing the outcome, and it turns out that it's going to be a sunk cost. What do we do then? Do we get emotional about it? Do we exacerbate the problem in our emotion? Or do we make a practical decision and do we move forward? It's the interesting thing about money, and I haven't gone into it as much as I probably wanted to at the beginning of the season, but money is a very interesting mistress in that money doesn't respect as much emotion as it does practicality. Whereas many other facets of our lives, we are over analyzing, we are over practical, we aren't using our emotion properly. So we use our emotion with money, and that does not serve us. Money does not respect emotion, and we use our practicality, our over-analyzation in many other areas of our lives doesn't serve us well in these other areas. It's a very interesting paradox of that which it is to be a human. You may be thinking, is the example of a ruthless hedge fund billionaire owning what some believe to be a cursed baseball team the psychological manifestation of the loss of two other baseball teams out of the metropolitan area of New York City? Is this actually an example of how we should live our lives, particularly when it comes to money, particularly when it comes to economics? Yes, dear listener, I am arguing to you that it is. Regardless of whether or not any of the prospects turn into major leaguers, regardless of whether or not the pitchers or the players that were traded end up going on to have very, very successful seasons with the teams they were traded to, the decision that Steve Cohen made was the correct decision. There is a learning curve in everything that we do. I'm going through it right now in switching careers this late in the game of life and going through all the growing pains that entails. Steve Cohen, the first year of his ownership, he liked to tweet. He liked to be out there in the public. He was a public figure, and that blew up in his face. And here we are in season 3, and you haven't heard tweet 1 out of Steve Cohen. Like many very wealthy people who buy a sports franchise, Steve Cohen went out and tried to buy himself a winner, and it didn't work. And he has demonstrated by way of trading many of those players that he learned that lesson. So the Steve Cohen learning curve, to me, is very steep. He's going to learn, and he's going to learn quickly. And like the rest of us, he's going to learn by making mistakes. That is to the long-term benefit of the New York Metropolitans. This is Why Don't Vote, a podcast.